And finally, I'll also establish a connection between all these things using something called as a connection string concept on the app service. So I'll take the connection strings from the SQL database, put it inside the app service, and make my infrastructure ready before I go into the release. Because if I want to release it, I want to deploy this on the app service, which is not there. I want to deploy it on the SQL database, which is not there. So the order is this: before I create the pipeline, I need the infrastructure out here. Then I can go into my pipeline strategy. I can see what is my CD strategy out there as such. And yes, also there's one very important thing: a connection between Azure DevOps portal and the Azure Cloud portal out here. These are the two things that are missing. So we'll also have to address that, but we'll incrementally do that as such. In this lecture, I want to see how I create the database, and I want to create a very simple CD pipeline out here, a very simple release pipeline to understand how the strategy really works out here, and so on and so forth. Yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions that I can take till here? Any questions?
Hi, sir.
Yeah, Akshay, go ahead, please.
So it means in real time we don't even use portal also. Like we all create resources in directly in Azure portal, the DevOps portal. No?
Correct. I wouldn't say creating resources on DevOps portal, but I would say using the DevOps portal, we try to deploy the resources on the Azure portal out here. We don't even touch the portal.
Okay, in release pipeline we give script for writing the creating work resources. No?
Correct. We would give steps for creating resources. So if you are using release pipelines to give steps to create the resources using either a PowerShell script or the ARM template or Terraforms, that procedure is called as the infrastructure as code. We call it as infrastructure as code, which we will include, going forward, how to go ahead and do that and all that stuff.
Thank you.
Yes, any more questions here, guys? Okay. So while my infrastructure is getting created, again, if you look at this one, it's created the infrastructure and etc. I'll go to the resource group, which is, let's say, the dev resource group out here. I have all these things right now, guys. I have my app service plan, sorry, the app service plan, the app service, the SQL database, the SQL server, and etc. If I go inside the database, if I show the connection strings, I have my entire connection string. I can copy this value, paste it inside the notepad. I'll remove the QA for now. I'll just place it this one, and I'll have to change the password. I'll have to replace this with the actual password. I'll say this is one. This is the password that I've given. Let me copy this entire string value now. So the string just tells you what is a SQL server, what is a SQL database, what is a user ID, what is a password, and etc. Copy this out. Come back into my Azure web app. Go into the configuration. And once I'm inside the configuration out here, I'll now go ahead, add a new connection string. I'll say the name of the connection string is SQL connection. That's what your code really requires. So if you go into your code and if you go into that particular service out here called courses.service, this is what it's looking for, called SQL connection out here. So this is what I'll do. I'll put this SQL connection here. I'll copy my entire connection string, paste it out here. I'll say that this is an SQL Azure. I'll say okay. I'll just save this out. So I'm going ahead and I'm in the connection string section. I'm adding my connection string and I'm saying what is the connection string value, what is the type of connection strings, and etc. And this is all in place. So the infrastructure right now is all in place. I created the infrastructure, added the connection strings, and this is all in place. Now I'll move into the release strategy. But before I move into the release strategy, Any questions that I can address? Anyone, any questions that I can address with the creation of infrastructure? Again, I haven't gone into the very detail of creation of the infrastructure. Reason being, we already covered this out in the earlier demos. So I do not want to, let's say, again, spend a lot of time to, let's say, explain that out there as such. So any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here that I can take? All right. Finally, moving into the release strategy. Let's go there. I will click on this one, will come here and say releases. Again, there are no release pipelines. So I'll say new pipeline. And now it's going to ask me, okay, fine, go ahead, give a new pipeline out here. Very importantly, build and releases are slightly different. Again, in a build pipeline also, you'll be able to see all these things out here like pipelines, task, variables, retention, options, history, and etc. But in a release pipeline, the pipeline is configured in the form of stages, like a dev stage, like a QA stage, like a staging environment. So stage environment, it's one and the same. I'll be alternatively using it. And then a production stage or an environment. And each and every stage has steps to perform. Steps here are nothing but what are the tasks out here. Like for example, I want to deploy my code. I also want to inject the SQL commands and all these things. So steps are also important. And after that, or before all these things, it's also telling you where are the artifacts. I know that you want to, let's say, sorry, I know that you want to, let's say, go ahead and deploy this out. But to deploy it, I need a source artifact, right? So where are the sources? This is something. These are a couple of questions that it's going to ask you, and also last but not the least, the name of the release pipeline. So what I'll do, I'll address one at a time. Firstly, I'll change my pipeline name to SQL Web App Release. I have a build and a release pipeline out here in that way. Here I'll say add the artifact. Now it's telling what is the source of your artifact. Is it a build pipeline in Azure DevOps? Do you have the Azure repository? Do you have the artifacts in the GitHub? Do you have it in DFEC? Do you have it in Azure Artifacts? Do you have it GitHub, Jenkins? What is it? I'll say, okay, fine, don't worry about that. It is a build pipeline which is producing an artifact. And the build pipeline is a part of this particular project called Devops Learning. You can also include pipelines from other projects. If let's say your pipeline is another project, you can also add that. But in my case, it's in Devops Learning 8. I'll say it is a SQL web app build. I'll say whatever is the latest version of the artifact, please take it. I'm good with that. I'll say add. This is my source artifacts, my source. And I'm telling my source is a build in Azure. Again, there are multiple sources like Jenkins, Docker, and if you also have the artifacts pre-built in something like a GitHub, you can also, let's say, take those artifacts out here and let's say include them as a part of your pipeline. And then comes the stages. Now it's saying, okay, fine. What stage that you want to add? I'll say, okay, fine. Add a stage. I'll say new stage. I'll say empty job. Start with an empty job out here. And here, the name of the stage, I'll say it is a development. So environment name or stage name one and the same. Now seeing it's a development environment. And in this stage, again, I have the agent job. I'll say this is a Windows latest agent, Azure pipelines. I'll say this is Windows latest. I want to maintain the configuration of my build and release. I built it using Windows latest. I also want to release it using Windows latest so as to maintain the configuration. And my release pipeline needs to do two things. Deploy the .zip file on a web app, inject the SQL commands out here into the SQL database. So I'll say, okay, fine. Add a task and I want to do a deployment on an Azure app service. So I'll search for something called Azure app service. There is a task with the name called Azure app service deploy. wherein it is telling deploy an app service to a web and etc. Deploy a zip file to a web and etc. I'll say okay, fine, add this out. Now it's telling okay, fine, your pipeline requires attention. Firstly, which web application you want to deploy. Again, the name of the web app is something like this. So if I go back into the resource group, let's identify a couple of details out here. The name of the web app is a dev web app 00 something from the SQL Server and etc. And it's now asking me what is the name of the web app, but before which it's telling, okay, fine, what is your Azure subscription? Where is this particular web app running? I'll say, okay, fine, if you go here, there is something called Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, because the reason being, if I click on this, I'm able to get the available subscriptions out here. Reason being, I'm using the same account for my DevOps and my portal. That's the reason it's showing. For you, it might be different. We'll also address if it is different, what you need to do and all these things out, which we will address there. But for now, I'll select this one out. I'll say this is Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. As and when I do that, it's telling you know what you need to authorize it out. So I'll say authorize, and I'll go ahead and give my sign in. I'll say this is gmail.com. String password is already there, so I'll say go ahead, authorize it out. It's now going ahead and signing in to my Azure portal and saying I'm authorizing it. So I'm authorizing your connection. I'm seeing whether everything is good and all that stuff. So it'll take a minute to authorize it out, and it's now trying to establish. Yes, now it's authorized. It's saying okay, fine, this is good enough, and it's established a connection with my Azure portal. I'll say good, great. Scroll down. It's telling okay, fine, what kind of an app service it is. I'll say it's a web on Windows, and it's now telling. I'm just clicking on this drop down, and I now have the name of the app service. Wherein it is telling it is dev web app and etc. I'll select this out and just scroll down. It's telling what do you want to deploy on this. I know that I want to deploy a .zip file. So I'll click on these three dots. I'll go into the drop. I'll select the SQL app.zip file here. I'll say okay. This is what I want to deploy. And this is all the configuration that I need to give to this first task, which is Azure App Service Deploy, wherein I'm telling what is the kind of connection. You have something called Azure App Service, or let's say Azure Resource Manager, and you have something called Publish Profile. 99 out of the every 100 times we use Azure Resource Manager as a connection type. As and when that's done, it's telling what is the name of your subscription. I had a button to authorize. So as and when I clicked on authorize, it went ahead, established a connection between my Azure DevOps account and the Azure portal out there. Then I have something called web app on Windows. I said it is web app on Windows out here. Finally, I said what is the name of the app service, which is dev web app 0 SQL and all these things out. Then then I'm telling what is the zip file that I want to deploy. This is the first task wherein I'm going ahead. I'm telling how do I deploy my zip file. Second here is injecting the commands from the database. So I'll add one more task. I'll say SQL data, just say SQL. Have Azure SQL database deployment. Saying deploy an Azure SQL using DACPack or run scripts or using SQL command and etc. I'll say great, this is what I need. Again, this needs attention. It says what is the Azure subscription. I'll say it is the Visual Studio Enterprise subscription that I do have. It's telling what is the name of your SQL server. I will say okay, fine. Let me go back into the portal. Let me go into the SQL server and also come here. There's an I information. It is telling like fabricam.databases.windows.net, comma 1433, or just like this. It's asking you for a fully qualified domain name of the SQL server, which you will see on the portal is this one. So I'll just copy this out. I'll just come back and I'll say the SQL server name is say Azure SQL or something dot databases.windows.net. I'll say it is a demo database. If I'm not wrong, that should be the database name, which is a demo DB. So I'll just copy this name out here, come back. So this is the demo DB. It's now asking how do you want to log in. I would say login credentials are usually sensitive information. So please do not expose them, for which I'll go to the variable section. I'll say add, I'll say username, I'll say username is test user, I'll say add, I'll say password is password that I've given, which is Microsoft -001, and I'll change this password type to be a secret. I'll lock this out. So now this is username and password. So I'll just copy this out, back into my tasks. I'll say in the login, it is dollar open close parenthesis inside which username, and then I also have password as a variable. So I copied it and I'm pasting it out here. So I'm saying username and password. Finally, it's telling what kind of a file you want to deploy. I'll say I have a SQL file. So now it's telling, okay, fine, great. I will deploy a SQL file. Can you tell me where the SQL file is? I'll click on these three dots. It's now telling, okay, fine, you have the artifacts. And from here, I'll take the commands.sql file and I'll say, okay. So in the app service deploy, I took the zip file. In the SQL task, I took the .sql file out here and I filled out all these details, telling what is my server name, what is my database name, what is the username, what is the password, and username and password are configured as Azure Devops variables out here. And I will say save, and I'll say draft pipeline or something like this. Okay. So now I have a source artifacts. I have a stage, a simple stage out here, which has two different tasks, which is going ahead releasing the code on the web app and also releasing the and also releasing the SQL file on the database out here. So two tasks in total, which I'll be using in order to go ahead and deploy things out here as such. Now, before I go ahead to create a release, any questions here? Anyone, any questions here?
Hi, sir.
Go ahead, Akshay, please.
So, what will be the case if you are creating virtual machine server in this instance
If you're
instead of a
creating a
web app?
virtual machine server instead of a web app, in that case, you'll have to use something called as a deployment group, which we'll talk about. If it's a virtual machine, again, deployments on a virtual machine are very, very low these days. But if you want to deploy it, you will have to make that particular virtual machine as a part of your Azure DevOps portal, and then you can release it out there as such, which is in the form of deployment groups. And in case of Azure App Service Deploy, you will say IIS deploy or IIS deploy and all that stuff. So it's telling you, okay, fine, go ahead, deploy it on a Windows virtual machine or a Linux virtual machine and etc. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
Yes, any more questions here, guys, before I create the
Hi,
release?
hi,
Anyone,
Kiran.
any question? Go ahead, Shiva.
On DevOps and Azure, we have different accounts. How to manage that? How to
Uh, that's what I was telling,
think?
is that yes, I will talk about that, but in order to talk about that, I'll have to talk about something called service connections and all these things out here. So we'll talk about it at the end of the session. We'll talk about it and also tell you how the service connections is established. It will take about 10 minutes for me to explain the same thing. Yes, any more questions here, guys? Anyone, any questions still here? All right, so let's go ahead, create a release, see how it's working, and then verify a couple of things out here. So I have my, let's say, steps and all configured. Pipeline is good to go. I'll go ahead, click on create release out here. It's telling, okay, fine. This is the version of artifact that I'll take, which is the latest, which is 04092022.1. Meaning if you go into your build pipeline, right? This is the build pipeline, and this is the version of your build 04092022.1, which is nothing but 4th of September 2022, and the first artifact that got produced today. So if I run a new pipeline, this will become 2022.0400904.2. This is the, let's say, the name of the artifact that will get produced. And let me come back to my release. I'll say create a release, as in when I do that, saying this is the version of the artifact. I have the only version out here. I'll say first release, and I have now created a new release pipeline, which is now going ahead and doing a job. Again, it's going to do initialize job. It's going to go ahead and do a couple of things like initializing the job, downloading the artifact, and then going ahead into your task, and then deploying your code onto the Azure web app, and then injecting the commands into the SQL server. This is what it's going to do. So it's now doing initialize job, and as a part of the initialize job, it's just getting the agent out here. It's telling what is the operating system, what is the Windows server, and all that stuff. And then it said download the artifacts. So all the artifacts are on your pipeline. So it's again downloading all the artifacts onto the agent machine. And finally, it's doing the app service deployment. So it's saying, okay, fine, I'm going into the app service and I'm now releasing all the code. So without you having to even click the button called build or deploy, you're coming with a pipeline or using a pipeline, you're doing all these things out here as such. And after the code deployment is done, which will take about 2 or 3 minutes. So it's now telling, okay, fine, I am going ahead deploying the code. It's telling package deployment initiated using a zip file. It's saying successfully deployed the package to the app service, which is good. And finally, it's going to come here into the next phase, wherein after it's done here, after the app service deployment is done, it will go into the SQL task, take that particular SQL file and release it onto your SQL database out here. Again, I'm not even touching the portal. I just authorize the portal once, not even touching it again. I'll just, let's say, wait for this one to be done, and I'll cross verify it out here as such. Again, it'll take like about 2 minutes. See, successfully updated the configuration. So if you look at this, successfully updated the configuration and everything. It's also restarted the web application. And finally, I am now doing a SQL task out here. So here in the background, it's just running a PowerShell command, telling invoke SQL command out here. It's telling what is a server, what is a database, what is a username, what is a password, what is the input file. So let me go back into the task, saying what is the input file and all these things out, wherein it is telling that the input file is commands.sql. And now as a part of it, it's also telling, okay, fine, the select statement, it's running the select statement out here, wherein it is telling, okay, fine, all these are injected.